Welcome, ladles and jelly spoons, to King's Bishop Teaches Chess. I am Coach Daniel, your host, also known as King's Bishop here at chess.com, and we're bringing another edition of the Fischer Friday video series. Today, the 20th round of the Portoroz Interzonal tournament, played on September 7th, 1958. Bobby Fischer facing off against Rodolfo Cardoso. Perhaps you'll remember Rodolfo from a match that Bobby played against him in New York the year before this. Rodolfo was born in Anda in the PI on December 25th, 1937. He was Philippine champion in 1958 and in 1963. He won the Asian Zonal Tournament of 1957 and 58 to qualify for this tournament. He was awarded the International Master title for scoring 2/3 of the possible points in that zonal, and he finished 19th place in this event. But it was a notable performance in the game against Bronstein. His last round in the event against his hero kept Bronstein out of the candidates. He later remarked that he actually regretted his victory more than any of his losses in the tournament because Bronstein was his idol. Cardoso is said to have discovered the 9-year-old Wesley So after seeing him play a queen sacrifice in a junior tournament. Rodolfo Cardoso. Of course, from Bobby, we have E4 best by test, as was his mantra, and Cardoso playing C6, the Caro-Kann defense. The opening is named after the English player Horatio Caro and the Austrian player Marcus Kahn, both of whom analyzed it together in 1886. Now, Marcus Kahn scored an impressive 24-move victory with this defense against the German-British chess champion Jacques Mises at the 4th German Chess Congress in Hamburg, May 1885. You might say he tore Mises to pieces. The Caro-Kann defense is known above all for its solidity. The defining move, of course, is the C6 move. It is the 4th most popular reply to E4 and nearly twice as common as the number 5 move. The point is to prepare for D5 without obstructing the queen's bishop, which is considered the main drawback of the French defense, of course. A standby for positional players at almost every level, the Caro-Kann was a particular favorite of world champion Anatoly Karpov, who has his own variation of the Caro-Kann. The pros of the Caro-Kann are the sound pawn structure that it produces, the unobstructed queen's bishop, as already mentioned, and the fact that it's safe and solid. Going against the Caro-Kann is that it yields less space for black and affords a slower development, and of course there are many different responses for white to choose from. There's a good lesson about the Caro-Kann over here at chess.com, and so I will link that lesson in the comments and description. Knight C3 from Bobby Fischer, D5, and Knight F3. The two knights attack. Pawn takes the pawn, knight takes the pawn, bishop G4 pinning the knight to the queen, H3 putting the question to the bishop, and bishop takes knight. You'll find this opening in Volume B, Section 10 of your Encyclopedia of Chess Openings. Queen takes the bishop, knight to D7. Now knight G5 from Fischer, threatening a scholar's checkmate. I don't think Cardoso's going to fall for that old trick, do you? The more popular move is to continue development, D4, king's knight to F6, bishop D3, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, knight F6, queen H4, pawn E6, kingside castles, and bishop E7. That line not played. Instead, Bobby playing knight G5 to the disdain of the annotator here. King's knight comes to the F6 square, and queen to b3, threatening the scholar's mate again and attacking the b-man here on b7. e6 obstructs the diagonal, and Bobby plays the most frequently played queen takes pawn. Marked inaccurate. The bot calling for g3 here, which of course facilitates bishop to g2. But Bobby with queen takes b7, and now knight d5 from Cardoso. There's a good threat of knight b4 here defended by the bishop. The eval bar indicating a slight favor for black, but it feels to me to be pretty equal. Bobby plays knight e4. That also held in disdain by the annotator. d4 called for here, which of course opens the door for the queen's bishop and simultaneously defends the knight against the queen's attack. Apparently the only way to keep the balance. You don't want to play queen takes the supposed free pawn here, thinking that this queen can't take your knight because of the check. Well, that's true, but he can play rook c8 first, hitting the queen. A little Zwischenzug. Now you have to pretty much try a counterattack here with knight takes e6, and then after rook takes the queen, knight takes the queen, king takes the knight. We'll play c3, moving our pawn to safety, and black has some good initiative and a huge development lead. Coming back to this point, if you play queen b5, you're just losing your knight for nothing. Let's go back. Knight e4 from Bobby Fischer. Now knight b4 is played. King d1 to defend. f5 hits the knight. Black with an advantage. c3 counterattacks. Probably not advisable, though, to take this square away from your knight, although the knight's likely to be captured. But you can accomplish the same task with a3 and see if he'll move his knight and give you knight c3. Less of a territorial or positional compromise is a3. c3 was played, and rook b8 hitting the queen. Queen takes the a-man. Now pawn takes the knight. And that's marked with a big red X. Knight d5 being called for, a better option. Of course, on knight d5, white still has to be concerned about his own knight. You could try a queen d4 here. And after, well, it's marked inaccurate. After pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn. Right. The point is now knight c5, and the white queen must take refuge elsewhere. So that's not the best try. You can't play knight g3 here either. Well, you could, but it's going to be answered with knight c5 either way. And we're just lost here, aren't we? Coming all the way back, Cardoso played pawn takes the knight, allowing Bobby to play pawn takes the knight. Bishop takes the pawn. That's marked as a mistake. I'm not real sure. Okay, well, it's calling for rook takes the pawn. But the point here is now Cardoso can castle. But rook takes pawn is interesting. On rook takes pawn, we can play a3, hitting the rook. And we can actually, black can actually hit the queen here with bishop c5. And on queen a6, rook d4, lining up with the king looks interesting. If queen takes c6, we can castle here. And black has every one of his pieces active, and white only has his queen in play. So this should be advantageous to black. Coming back, Cardoso with the bishop takes pawn, preparing to castle. Queen d4 from Bobby, and this gives white a smidge of initiative after castles. Bishop c4. Don't take this pawn here with the queen. That's going to allow rook takes the f-man here. And then on bishop d3 with this battery attack, the knight can come to f6, defending and attacking. All right, technically we could grab this pawn to boot, but be careful, your bishop is presently undefended. Okay, you could counterattack and see if you can finagle a trade, but he doesn't have to take the trade. He can grab this pawn. Meanwhile, this bishop is still en prise. You might have to actually bring your king out, and that's a little bit dangerous, isn't it? Well, coming back, don't play queen takes the pawn. Better is the bishop c4 try. The bot actually calling for a3. Knight c5 from Cardoso. That's marked as a mistake, with king h8 being preferred. Of course, getting out of the bishop's line of fire, right? Makes perfect sense. Knight c5 says, well, I'm going to defend that pawn. Queen takes queen. Queen's rook takes queen. Rook f1. Rook d4 hitting the bishop. b3 defends the bishop and gives us a place for our other bishop. Bishop takes the d-man, marked as a mistake here as well. Rook fd8 makes more sense. Form the battery and the super attack. Bishop takes the pawn was tried. King e2 stepping out of the line of fire. If he takes with the bishop, we'll certainly see those rooks doubled, right? So he'll get his material back regardless. King e2, though, from Bobby. And bishop takes bishop, marked inaccurate. And I'm frankly just not good enough to tell you why that's inaccurate. Queen's rook takes the bishop. The bot preferring the king's rook in order to maintain defense of the A-man. Coming back, Bobby took with the queen's rook. King's rook to d8 is played. Right, well, given that we've given up the defense of the A-man, perhaps the better try is rook a8. That seems preferable. But he doubles his rooks on the open D file, very principled. Now king's rook to d1, preventing rook d2. King f8, getting out of the bishop's line of fire. Rook takes the rook. Rook takes the rook. Now rook d1. And rook takes rook, and king takes rook. And we go into a bishop versus knight endgame with a nice outside passed pawn. Meanwhile, black's pawns look like Swiss cheese up here, all isolated. King e7, king d2, king d6, king c3. That's marked inaccurate, with king e3, the more centralized move, being called for, but I personally prefer to push that passed pawn. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. Get a check mark for that move, but the eval bar tells me I am fine and dandy. King c3 was played, perhaps liberating the bishop and defending this pawn, and this will push in good time. Knight d7, king d4, knight f6, pawn a4. There we go. c5 check, king e3, pawn g5 here. Bishop e2, king c6, bishop back to c4, pawn e5. Marked inaccurate. The player's approaching that critical point in every tournament game when you begin to run out of time on your clock. a5 marked as a mistake. h6, king d2, h5. The bot not liking any of these moves. King e3. Both players look like they're just kind of hastening their moves towards satisfying the time control, which is why you see some inaccuracies here. h4, bishop e2, king b7, bishop back to c4, king d2 called for here. You could also play bishop f1 here with perfect satisfaction, and the bot says that gets a star. Bobby with bishop c4, king c6, king e2, king back to b7, king to d2, king back to c6, king e3, now king back to b7, king to d2. King c7 was played, g4 called for. You could play king c6 here as well, I would think. Yeah, I get a star for that. King c7 was played. g4, king c6, Now king c3, knight e8, marked as a mistake. b4, knight d6. That's preventing b5 from being played. Bishop to f1. Pawn takes pawn check, king takes pawn. Now knight c8. Well, the eval bar really liking Bobby's position here once the smoke has cleared and they've gotten through the time control. Bishop g2, pinning the pawn to the king, and that's going to win the pawn unless Cardoso wants to play knight d6. Well, on knight d6, I'll probably just put my bishop back on f1. He actually went king d5 to defend the pawn. a6, knight a7 blockading, king a5, and black has got to prevent king b6 here, so he tries king c5. King c6 being called for, but of course king c6 is only going to allow bishop takes the pawn with check. And then you have to play to c5 anyway. So Cardoso, not willing to give Bobby a free move, played his king to c5 straight away. Bishop takes the pawn in either case. Now knight to b5 is played, bishop back to g2, knight back to a7. Here king to a4 is played, knight back to b5. And his job is very plain. Just keep that passed pawn blockaded. King to b3, king to b6, king to c4, king takes the pawn, king to d5. By the way, bishop f1 is going to be clearly winning here if it's allowed to be played, because trading off your bishop for this knight with your king way better than his, you just clean up and promote one of your pawns. So king b6 gets out of the pin before it can be played. King takes the pawn, king c7, king f6, knight c3, king takes the next pawn on g5, knight d1. Of course, if he can trade off his knight for these three pawns, the game will be drawn. We're not going to let him do that. Pawn f4, king d6, king takes the h-man, draw guaranteed, but obviously with three passed pawns it should be a win. King e6, king back to g5, king f7, pawn f5, and Cardoso resigned here. Bobby's accuracy was 90.8, and he had a single game rating of 2650. Both players played an amazing opening, but Bobby was a cut above in the middle game and simply outmaneuvered him in the end game. Now let's just play this out a little bit. Let's suppose knight e3 hitting the bishop. We'll play bishop f3, and on king g7, we'll play pawn f6 check. On king h8, we will play king f4, hitting the knight, and on knight c2, we will move our other pawn forward, and we'll use all of these pieces and move them up as a unit. On knight d4, we'll play bishop d5, and we're beginning to contain our opponent's king. On king h7, we'll play king e5, hitting the knight again, and when the knight returns to c2, we can fork. So it's marked inaccurate, of course. Instead, it says play knight to b5. Well, on knight b5, I can play bishop f7, and the path to promotion is plainly protected, isn't it? On knight a7, we will play pawn g6 check, and on king h6, we will push our pawn. He can throw a check here. Now king f5, he can throw another check right here, but king g4, and he's out of useful checks. If he plays knight c2 here, we'll go ahead and grab the queen. He has one more check he can play, but now king f3, and checkmate comes on the next turn, regardless of what he plays. The king, of course, is paralyzed, so he'd have to move his knight, and it doesn't matter which square he moves his knight to. It matters not. Every one of those squares is answered by queen g6 checkmate. There you go. I hope this was helpful to you, or that you enjoyed it at least. Until next time, Have a great day and play some great chess. Bye now.